Okay, so we're going to begin. Welcome everybody to the CNCF Cloud Native Computing Foundation webinar series, and thank you all for coming today. I'm Mark Coleman, and I'm the chairperson for the CNCF Marketing Committee. This is the first in the new CNCF webinar series, and it is our intention to run these webinars at least monthly from now on, with topics ranging from low-level technical deep dives to high-level webinars like this one. Today, we're very lucky to have Jamie Dobson as our speaker. For 16 years, Jamie has been helping companies to succeed with technology, and in that time, he has built a unique and entertaining way of explaining what can be a very difficult subject. In his latest challenge, Jamie has been working as the CEO of Container Solutions, who are helping companies worldwide with their cloud-native journeys. Now, just before we get started, a couple of house rules. You're all on mute, so if you do have questions, you can either put them in the group chat that I see some of you are already using, or you can use the Q&A functionality that you'll find down at the bottom of the viewer. Also, in case you have any colleagues who couldn't make it today, we will be recording this session, and we will send it out later to all the attendees in the session. Jamie, are you ready?
I am indeed, Mark.
Then take it away.
Okay, thank you, Mark, very much for that introduction. And hello and welcome everybody to this inaugural Cloud Native Computing Foundation webinar. I wanted to say to people good evening because I'm in London today, but I realise that if you're from the United States or different parts of the world, of course it would be good morning or good evening depending. So I will simply say welcome. We're very happy at Container Solutions to be helping with the CNCF. We're very much aligned with its mission. The CNCF itself has got some amazing conferences, so we'll be sponsoring in Berlin KubeCon and CNCFCon next year. And we're also very pleased to have both Pini Resnick from our Dutch office and Michael Mueller from our Swiss office as part of the CNCF Ambassador Program. So should you need to reach out to those guys at any point about anything, please feel free to do so. So as Mark said, my name is Jamie Dobson. I'm the CEO of Container Solutions. And what we do is try to help companies succeed with cloud native computing. You'll be able to ask questions through the Q&A functionality of the software. Alternatively, you can always find me on Twitter, and my handle is @Jamie Dobson. So what I'd like to do today, I'm really hoping to inspire people to take what they learn and see if they can apply strategic thinking to their own initiatives. So I guess I'm trying to open people's mind to the potential of strategy and strategic thinking. The three key takeaways are going to be, firstly, what is strategy? I think this word needs defining. And secondly, I'd really like people to take away the importance of defining the problem it is that you're actually trying to solve. And the third point I will make, or the third big takeaway, is how do we make forward progress with limited information, which is, of course, another way of saying, how do we make forward progress in great uncertainty? So the agenda will break down like this. We'll start with strategy and a definition. We're going to ask the question, can this be applied to cloud native? Then we're going to look at the problem space. Then we're going to quickly look about how we iterate and move through the problem space, which is, of course, with limited information. And then finally, I'd like to offer some guidelines and some conclusions. There'll be plenty of time at the end of the webinar for questions. So one of the most important things we need to get out of the way is when to use strategy. So these are the three key criteria that I use when I'm deciding whether the change I'm about to make is a strategic change or not. So the first thing would be, does the change transcend organizational boundaries? Does it affect more than one group of people? The second criteria would be, is the organization lacking key capabilities? Which is another way of saying, can the organization make this change itself, or will it need to change its core staff and its core capabilities? And of course, the third thing would be, does this change create winners and losers and therefore resistance? So what we're going to do is work through the webinar this evening, and at the end of the talk, we're going to come back and look at these three criteria again. So without much more messing about, I'd like us to now try to see if we can actually define strategy. So strategy as a word has been used and abused kicked, pulled around in so many directions that it no longer carries any meaning. Now, most normal people are allergic to this word. Sometimes I say that engineers are likely to vomit a little in their mouths at the merest hint of its mention. So to get around this problem of people being allergic to strategy, and so we can, so we can have a decent conversation about it, is I'd like to settle on what a good definition is. Now, for that, I always like to travel back to ancient Greece and the story of Odysseus. So after the Battle of Troy, Odysseus, who in Roman myth, by the way, was called Ulysses, sets off with his crew back to his kingdom of Ithaca. Now, at the beginning of the journey, during a daring raid, Odysseus had managed to blind the Cyclops Polyphemus, who was actually the son of Poseidon. Now, as revenge, Poseidon cursed Odysseus to be at sea for the following 10 years. Now, this began a series of adventures and escapades. One such escapade was with the Sirens. Now, the Sirens were enchantresses whose beautiful singing lured sailors to their deaths. Wanting to listen to the music, Odysseus came up with a dual action plan to outsmart the Sirens. So the first thing he did is he got his crew to place melted wax in their ears. What he then had them do was tie him to the mast with strict instructions not to release him. Of course, what happened next? They sailed past the Sirens, Odysseus got to listen to the music, and I think they probably declared mission accomplished. So it's through the story of Odysseus that we can start to tease apart the components of strategy. Firstly, it's worth noting that strategy involves situational awareness. So Odysseus knows of the Sirens and he knows of the opportunity that they present. But he is also aware of his crew's capabilities. And if his crew were not capable, then Odysseus' strategy would have been to train them or to replace them. So this is often why strategy is often wrongly reduced to capacity building or team building. Another thing to note, there's a working coalition without which nothing ever gets done. Everyone in the coalition has the same goal, there's risk, and therefore there's an element of courage, or an element of courage is required. Finally, but extremely importantly, there's the notion of self-supporting actions. So there's nothing wrong, there's nothing intrinsically wrong with putting wax in your ears. It's just that putting wax in your ears is not a useful action if you're wrestling the Minotaur on Crete. Now, in much the same way, there's nothing intrinsically good or bad about a containerized workflow or the use of provisioning tools in operation. It's just that some tools don't play well together. In other words, some actions, although fine in their local settings, don't support each other in a global setting. Now, finally, we can see that Odysseus' story was really one of many steps. The purpose of each step was to move to a current, newer state. So you see, the Sirens was just one adventure that Odysseus had to cope with. So the idea here is to move from newer to better states. And it was through each step that Odysseus would achieve his ultimate goal of returning to his family on Ithaca, where he would of course have to immediately deal with his political enemies. Strategy, we can thus conclude, is a continuous process. We win the battle, but we must then win the peace. We win the election, but we must then govern. We use containers, but we must then orchestrate them. We win a customer base, but then we must keep it. So, summarizing the story of Odysseus into one definition, we can settle on something like this. Strategy is a way through a difficulty. It's an approach to overcoming an obstacle, and it's a response to a specific challenge. This leads us to this question: how can we apply this to our efforts in, let's say, going cloud native or succeeding with cloud native computing? So, the story of the Sirens is really one of fatal attraction. So one of the most common problems I see in my daily work is idea copying. This plays out a little bit like this. An executive goes to a conference and they see somebody like Adrian Cockcroft give a talk about Netflix. The executive remembers microservices, highly available, 2 pizzas. He remembers auto-scaling, load balancing, and words like that. The executive duly returns to work and says, "We're going to be the Netflix of the Netherlands." To which one can only reply, "That's quite funny because they stream videos and you're a bank." So a good question is, how many executives have shipwrecked themselves against the shore of shiny things? What did they do wrong? So we've already heard about the story of Odysseus. Let's take another story, one of Aesop's most famous fables. This was the story of a golden goose. And the golden goose laid, actually, forgive me, the goose was not golden. The goose was a normal goose which laid golden eggs. And this gentleman in the picture here was sent to steal the goose. Unfortunately, what he did, attracted to the golden eggs, he stole the eggs instead, leaving the goose behind. So the goose of strategy is actually a combination of thought and decisive action. In the case of Netflix, the golden eggs are streaming videos that are enabled by a flexible architecture and a flexible team. So one of the most important lessons here is that strategy is the goose. It's the thought processes you need and not the shiny things that are a result of those thought processes. So this brings us very nicely onto lesson 1, the key lesson of strategy. Don't steal ideas, but rather steal the processes that created those ideas. So this brings us back momentarily to situational awareness, self-supporting actions, and capabilities. What those 3 things actually are a way of defining the problem you're trying to solve. So the process of creating situational awareness starts with a little bit of analysis. Analysis should always include a note on your current capabilities, the capabilities you expect to need, and the sorts of activities that would support each other. In other words, creating situational awareness is about defining the problem you are trying to solve and the steps you can take in order to solve it. If you look at the image now, you can see a problem space. Some people would refer to this as a map. Now, this particular map is the result of a bit of analysis we did with a customer about 1 year ago. You can see that the cloud-native capabilities are roughly split into 3 areas: organizational, infrastructure, and application development. You can see that there is overlap between the 3 main areas, and this is for 2 reasons. Firstly, nowadays, infrastructure is programmable. This means that creating infra is a job that is shared across the organization. Secondly, the shape of your architecture always reflects the shape of your organization. In other words, most companies cannot do microservices, which is to say they cannot change the shape of their systems without changing their own structure. So this is why we say going cloud native is always a strategic change. If you cast your mind back to the beginning of the webinar, I said that one of my key criteria for a strategic change was a change that transcended organizational boundaries. Now, if you do believe that the shape of your systems reflect the shape of your organization, then it's fair to say your organization needs to change shape in order, for example, to have 2 pizza teams, each of which work on a particular microservice. Now, we saw that Odysseus's journey was a series of steps. Now, we can also figure out, more or less, that as time passed, his understanding also grew. One of the questions we have in technology, when using cloud-native technologies or in business in general, is how can we expand our maps, like the one we see here, whilst moving through the space? Well, the answer to that question is with great caution. For reasons quite unknown to me, many writers on strategy seem to imply that the more uncertain the conditions are, the more we should plan. This is actually illogical. Chess masters fighting it out take small steps to improve their position. Their next step includes building on whatever current advantage they have whilst creating potential new actions. So for example, if a team has automated their build process and broken their application into, let's say, 6 services, a good move would be to containerize the services. This move would build on their previous advantages and it in itself would create a series of potential next steps. One such step would be, for example, to start using Kubernetes or the OpenDCOS, both of which would give you functionality out of the box whilst reducing your AWS bill. The point is, you build on advantage and you don't plan into the future in a time of great uncertainty. Now, one of my role models in this space, Simon Wardley, the inventor of the Wardley map, talks about strategy as crossing the river by feeling the stones. For us, in the world of cloud native, where everything is new, we have to find a way to move through the space and to cross our own rivers. Now, this leads us to one of the most important lessons of this webinar. In times of great uncertainty, take smaller steps. This, of course, creates a different question. How do we cross our cloud native rivers? So at the beginning, our map will, of course, be quite awful. And so we need to start with discovery. We need to explore and work out what the problem actually is we're trying to solve. Now, you recall earlier that strategy is a response to a problem. If we can't define the problem, we can't go on and solve it. Only when we have found a problem that is small enough do we think about defining the materials. Now, what do we mean by materials? Well, it could be that if the problem has to do with capabilities, the materials would be training, books, maybe a hackathon. If the problem is to do with, for example, service discovery, the materials would be tools, advice, maybe a comparative study. The point is, once we have the materials, we can then move through the cycle and start to deliver the solution. The trick, especially in the beginning, is to try to get through the cycle as soon as possible. The more cycles you do, the more you learn, and therefore the more your situational awareness increases and the more of the map you uncover. So this leads us to lesson 5. The quicker the cycle time, the quicker you can learn. Now, it's possible to take the D learning cycle and look at it in a different way, look at it with a different model. So now let's take a look at the J curve. This is the J curve. It starts on the vertical axis before dropping down and rising further down the horizontal axis. Every time we pass through a D cycle, we incur a cost. So this was true for Odysseus and his detour past the Sirens. It was certainly true for Netflix as they built their systems out. And this cost is represented on the J curve by the space under the horizontal axis. Now, at the bottom of the curve, just before it turns up, we are no longer spending money, but we're actually collecting value. Finally, once the curve meets the horizon, we've broken even on the cycle and we can continue to collect value indefinitely. Let me give an example which might help here. About 15 months ago, we worked with a customer who had wanted to go cloud native. We worked with their managers and what we discovered was a long list of goals. For example, they'd wanted 2 pizza teams, microservices, continuous integration, A/B testing. Now, on top of that, they told us they wanted to be community leaders, traveling the world, speaking at conferences, and attracting the world's best talent back to their office and to their organization. So, of course, the first thing I asked was, what are your actions to achieve these goals? Unfortunately, the action list was very empty. And as a matter of fact, there were no actions at all. No courses. There was no time set aside for self-study, no engagement with the community. Essentially, this company was stuck. On top of that, they'd said to us, can you please give us 15 engineers so they can come and, quote, sort it all out. So this leads us to a very famous strategic anti-pattern. A strategy that has lots of goals and no actions is actually an anti-pattern. And you can think of this, if you like, as the Christmas wish list. Wish lists based on what you want, greedy lists, are not strategic. They're pure fantasy. One good takeaway from this webinar is to go back to your own organisation, look at your plans for 2017, speak to your managers, speak to yourself if you are the manager. How many goals do you have and how many actions, not what you're thinking about, I'm not talking about actions that you're thinking about, how many actions have you actually got penciled in for January 2017? Because if there's lots of goals and no actions, you're about to have a very, very bad year. This is true if you're going cloud native, and it's true if it's simply another part of your business strategy. So back to our customer then. We began helping by first getting everybody in the same room. We began to build situational awareness and some potential next actions. Building on the advantage we had, which in this case was the company's knowledge of its own systems, we took one step into the triple D cycle. In doing so, we discovered the problem was a lack of knowledge. So we started to define the materials as an intensive, week-long deep dive into containerization. So no more two-peter teams, no more microservices, absolutely no more continuous integration, no more A/B testing, no talk about customer-centric, and absolutely no mention of hiring 15 consultants. What we instead did was create one very simple goal. We're going to create a map and a few very simple actions, namely a 2-day training course followed by an intensive offsite. So the materials we defined, the intensive week-long deep dive into containerization. It was during this week that we ripped up the existing systems, containerized them, and using a practice known as scratch refactoring, started to learn. So scratch refactoring is a technique we use where we pull a repo, rip everything to shreds, but we never commit anything back. In other words, the process was about learning and not necessarily about creating new features. Finally, we delivered the solution back. And the way we did it in this particular instance was for the team we've been working with to give a presentation to some of the managers and engineers of that particular company. So this worked so well that what we did is we repeated this in the following 5 weeks for the rest of the teams. So in 6 weeks, we'd managed to pass through a J-curve. We'd incurred the cost, but we'd already started to create the value. And what we'd actually managed to do was align the whole company around containerized microservices. That client had their own map, which they then worked through, and then within 1 year, without any extra help from my team, they'd move all of the services to containers and were running Kubernetes in production. Of course, things can go wrong when you're modeling behavior with the J-curve. The main problem is one of greed and stupidity. Managers try to enter into 2 J's at the same time. I saw Jeffrey Moore talk about this a few weeks ago, and I'd like to acknowledge Jeffrey for inspiring me to use the J-curve. Jeffrey said, "It's true you shouldn't put all your eggs in one basket. However," he said, "a chicken can't lay 2 eggs at the same time. It's bad for the chicken and it's bad for the eggs." I simply think of it like this. What would have happened if Odysseus split his crew and sent half of them to sail past the sirens and the other half to fight the Minotaur? Most likely, they'd have all gotten killed. Now, entrepreneurs are closer to death, which is why they are acutely aware of starting multiple J-curves. This creates our second strategic anti-pattern. Be very mindful of doing 2 or more than 2 things at once. Now, another problem with the triple D cycle and the J-curve is this. People lose faith. Once you've committed, you cannot flinch. You must finish what you start. But people panic. They lose faith and they give up. Now, what you are left with is what we call at Container Solutions a cloud native crime scene. Your hybrid cloud half works. Your containerized workflow is okay, but the operations team manually unpack the containers in production. Your team sort of know how to test contracts between microservices. So this gives us our third anti-pattern of the evening: not finishing what you start. It is possible to steal some lessons. Now, the most important thing is to get in and out of the J-curve as quickly as possible. The best way to do this is by taking small steps. This is what startups do. They need a quick return on their investments. You can, of course, get out of a J-curve quicker by seeking help, seeking a wider coalition, which is, of course, exactly what enterprises do when they work with consultancies and vendors. However, let me point out something very important at this point. Buying knowledge in the information age or in the open source age doesn't necessarily mean working with vendors or consultancies. This is especially true when you think about cloud native and the CNCF. The CNCF itself has an excellent community, brilliant ambassador program, reference applications, online tutorials for Kubernetes, a very active Slack channel, and brilliant conferences. But even more than that, the CNCF itself is only one coalition, if you will, but there are many other people out there contributing knowledge and lessons. And so buying knowledge in this sort of environment, or the cost of buying that knowledge, is actually much more to do with your time and your creativity than it is to do with the financial cost. And one of the most remarkable things to me, in my observations, is just how much amazing work we can do with such a little amount of money. I guess, just as a small aside, that is one of the most exciting things about working in this space right now. It certainly makes the job of strategy formulation and strategy execution much simpler. So this brings us then to our final lesson of the evening, is that in times of great uncertainty, you should buy knowledge. But just remember, buying knowledge doesn't necessarily mean paying for it. So let us start to now wrap things up a little bit so we can get on to the question and answer session. Let's recap the lessons. The first one was, don't steal ideas. What you really want is to steal the thought processes that create those ideas and see what ideas you can self-generate. Don't forget, you will have the best situational awareness regarding your own capabilities and your own team. I mentioned a case study earlier about a customer or a collaboration of ours where they wanted to go cloud native, and I said we built on their advantage. Their advantage was knowledge of their systems. So we take that advantage and we bring in a little bit of extra knowledge to get them moving. Lesson 2, steal the processes that created those ideas. Strategy is a game of cunning. You need to be smart and you need to seek advantage wherever you can find it. Very importantly, you must define the problem you are trying to solve. Strategy is itself a response to a problem, it's a response to a challenge. If you can't define that problem, how on earth do you intend to solve it? If you don't know your problem, then I can tell you this: your problem is to find your problem. Lesson 4, in times of great uncertainty, take smaller steps. Small businesses can't afford to do it, but believe me, neither can big businesses. They may have the money, but what they'll do is they'll waste a lot of time and a lot of resources chasing shiny objects. They will shipwreck themselves. Lesson 5, get in and get out. The quicker your cycle time, the quicker you learn. There are competitive advantages to going quick. A perfect plan executed next week is not as good as a rubbish plan executed today. In times of great uncertainty, buy knowledge. Don't be afraid to do this, but remember, buying something in the open source age doesn't necessarily mean paying for it. And of course, finally, knowing when to use strategy. If the change you want to make, and I'm assuming it's an adaptive change, a positive change, is local to your group, or is small enough, or your company is small enough, if it's localized, and you have all the capabilities, and you're not going to create winners and losers, you don't need strategy. You just need a plan and a little bit of common sense. Don't call it a strategy when it isn't, because all you'll actually do is contribute to destroying the word strategy. And right now it needs all the help it can get. So be aware of the situations. Use the criteria. Does this problem transcend boundaries? Do we have the capabilities? Will it create winners and losers? If not, then a strategy is not needed, but just a little bit of planning. And the anti-patterns. If you take anything away from today, take these with you. Take them back to your organization and apply them to the plans you have for next year. If you're an engineer and you have a boss, apply these against your boss's plans and ideas for the new year. Is there a long wish list? Is it goal heavy and action light? Does the proposed strategy seek to do 2, 3, or 4 things at once? If it does, you can advise your manager to break those 4 things up into a sequential order. In the literature, this is known as staging. Finally, a reinforcement of the lessons. Don't be stupid. Stealing people's ideas is extremely stupid and unoriginal. Take this from Odysseus. He was extremely creative. Finally, this slide needs a special mention. I've been working as an entrepreneur or a small or medium business owner for a long time now, but I've also taken really senior positions in larger organizations. And of all my work in strategy, the good ideas, the movement with limited information, I've actually come to see that one of the key advantages to strategic thinking is as follows. Strategic thinking creates highly motivated individuals and teams. By its very definition, you're mastering new skills when you're being strategic. You're going to do something new. You're going to move from an old state to a better, newer state. This always requires mastering new capabilities. You're going to have a problem, and your goal is to solve it, so you're going to have purpose. And finally, there should always be a little bit of room for autonomy, otherwise nothing can ever get done. So strategy done right hits all of these 3 criteria. For those of you who have read Daniel Pink's book, Drive, you will realize that these 3 things taken together are actually the backbone of highly motivated teams. So just to wrap this up before the questions then, there is no real science to strategy. And even worse than that, there's no end to it. The relief that one feels upon finishing a romantic novel that has passed through a setup, complication, and final resolution will never ever be felt by the strategist. Rather, the momentary relief one feels after an episode of Game of Thrones, only to be plunged back into terror as the plot thickens in the next episode, is much more what the strategist has to deal with. Strategy then is not for the faint-hearted. So what it is instead is it's not a game of following, but it's a game of thinking and doing. It's a game of courage, a game of passing through states and doing so with as much enthusiasm as you can muster. Models and myths help, but they can only take us so far. The rest, unfortunately, is up to us. On that note, I'd like to say thank you to Mark Coleman for organising this and to the CNCF. I would like to give an acknowledgement to Geoffrey Moore, whose idea of J-curves I took for this webinar, Richard Rummel, who wrote an excellent book, Good Strategy, Bad Strategy, Andy Gove, Charles Handy, and a special mention to Lawrence Friedman. I found this book to be a wonderful companion. I read it cover to cover, and I've kept it as a handbook during my own work in recent times. And it was Friedman's explanation of Greek myths that really led me to Odysseus and all the other stories, which I found particularly helpful. And on that note, I will hand back to Mark, and I would say thank you very much for joining me and listening this evening.
Well, thank you, Jamie. And the strange thing with webinars is this normally where there would be some applause, but unfortunately we can't do that. So I'd like to jump in with a question straight away, which is that there's quite a lot of material to absorb here in one go. if I was starting from zero right now, how would you say I should become a better strategist?
Well, I think one of the myths of strategy is it's a cognitive process. It's something it's something you do by thinking. The best way to learn is by doing. So if you want to become a better strategist, I would start by small experiments, trying things and trying to observe the world around you. So observation is key. A lot of the CEOs I know, or successful engineers, they've always got a good system of observation. They keep a diary and they do public speaking, which forces them to reflect on previous actions. And usually they've got a very good reading habit. I think most importantly, you need lots and lots of space in order to do strategy properly. It's very difficult to do strategy formulation and thinking if you're a line manager with lots and lots of sort of admin tasks and no time to spend with your people. So I guess it starts with observation.
And following on from that, I mean, so telling the story through these various stories is very useful, of course. But are there any sort of concrete, what's the word I'm looking for? Like character types that you've seen that fit or don't fit with this sort of thinking, or perhaps just like concrete stories that you could tell?
Well, we started to, so I created an appendix to this PowerPoint, to this presentation, because one of the things we did so over the last 2 years, we've been collecting archetypes. So let me share a few of you now. I've got this appendix called Other Useful Models. I'm going to skip through this. And this is an interesting one. So we started to interview people. Of course, we had some clients or customers who point blank refused to engage with us. So I would turn up to their office and they would say, these are our goals for the next year. Can you help us? And I would try to get them to slow down and forget the goals momentarily and to focus on their actions and their capabilities. Some of those customers just showed me the door. They said that, we want you to come and fix all of this. That's unlikely. That's a bad strategy and it's unlikely to succeed. Now, anybody who would listen to us, and work with us, we started to notice these archetypes. And what we settled upon was this one for the strategist. The absolute best people we've observed have got lots of empathy because they choose to represent a certain group. Often it could be operations group, a dev group, or a whole company. They've got this voice, right? And you need a voice because you have to represent the people you're working with, but also your voice helps you connect. It gives you a chance to, share your ideas and share your vision. Most importantly, they have a deep understanding of reality. One of the biggest pieces of advice I always give is never ever ask the question, where should we go? That's the land of the fantasists, right? What should we do next year? Let's do microservices. It's a better question to ask, what's going on right now? Because if you've got a 6-week release cycle, there's really no point talking about containers and Kubernetes because you've got a much, much bigger problem you need to solve. So another anti-pattern of strategy is simply refusing to look reality in the face. Now, the strategists are actually extremely rare. What we discovered a lot of was what we call the fantasist. Now, the fantasist has got a great imagination, massive voice, usually a vision. The vision they usually steal from somebody else. They steal the golden eggs of strategy after going to a conference and learning about microservices and all this stuff. Fantasists drive their organizations crazy by sending them on wild goose chases and initiating 1 million change programs all at once. Now, another archetype we found was this, the angry engineer. This one usually gets a laugh when I do this talk in public because many, many people align with this. They've got tremendous empathy for the group they represent, a massive voice, usually highly credible. There's one part of reality they don't understand, which is that managers don't like to be shouted at. And what the angry engineer doesn't get is that whether they like it or not, management is power. Nothing gets done without management. Real strategists are hard to find, but if you merge the angry engineer with the fantasist, you do get to something that looks like a strategist. And if you look around, some of the best strategists in the world have always had a right-hand man or a right-hand woman. And that's to make up for their own deficiencies. So the very first job, you asked me earlier, how do I become a better strategist? Start with observation of your environment, but also of yourself, and work out the things you're not good at and find somebody who is good at those things.
Well, thanks for that, Jamie. So we have quite a bit of time left. There are no questions coming through right now, so I think we're going to call it there. What I want to say before everybody leaves is this was the first in a series that we're kicking off right now. We're aiming for at least monthly, and as I said at the beginning, we're going to be going from low-level technical deep dives into higher-level topics such as strategy. In January 12th, we have a look at cloud-native networking, and anyone that's been in this call will be receiving a notification about that. So if that's interesting for you, then I hope to see you then. The only thing that's really left for me to do is to thank the CNCF for making all of this happen, and Jamie, of course, for his talk about strategy this evening. Thank you, Jamie.
Thank you, Mark.
And that's it. I'll now end the call. Thank you, everybody, and goodbye.